The letter arrived like a guillotine, slicing through Caleb's heart with surgical precision. "You are no longer my son," it read, his mother's meticulous handwriting a cruel contrast to the venom of her words. At 22, Caleb had dared to confess his truth. He was gay, and his world shattered. He stood frozen in his small Boston apartment, the paper trembling in his hands, the ink blurring as tears fell. Caleb had always known his mother, Margaret, was devout, her life anchored by the rigid doctrines of her small-town church in rural Maine. But he'd hoped, foolishly, he now realized, that love might outweigh dogma. He was wrong. By evening, he was on the phone with Ethan, his boyfriend of 6 months, voice cracking as he recounted the letter. Ethan, with his soft hazel eyes and unshakable calm, drove across town to hold him. They sat on the worn couch, Caleb's head on Ethan's shoulder, the silence heavy with shared pain. "You're enough," Ethan whispered, his voice a lifeline. "You're more than enough." Caleb and Ethan had met at a local bookstore, their hands brushing over the same dog-eared copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Caleb, with his quiet intensity and tousled blonde hair, had been drawn to Ethan's warmth, his easy laugh that lit up the dimmest rooms. Their connection was instant, a spark that grew into a flame neither could ignore. But Caleb's fear of his mother's judgment had kept him guarded, his love for Ethan a secret he'd only recently dared to share. Now, that secret had cost him his family. The days that followed were a blur of grief and defiance. Caleb threw himself into his work as a graphic designer, channeling his pain into vibrant, chaotic designs that earned him praise at the small firm where he freelanced. Ethan, a social worker with a knack for listening, became his anchor. They built a life together in Boston's South End, their apartment a haven of mismatched furniture, books, and quiet evenings cooking pasta while jazz played softly in the background. But the wound of Margaret's rejection festered. Caleb avoided her calls, deleted her voicemails unheard, and ignored the occasional letters that arrived, their envelopes pristine and formal. He told himself he didn't need her approval, but late at night, when Ethan slept beside him, Caleb's mind replayed memories of his childhood, his mother's laughter as they baked cookies, her gentle hands tucking him into bed. How could that woman, so full of love, cast him out? 2 years passed, and Caleb's life with Ethan deepened. They adopted a scruffy terrier named Walt, after Whitman, and spent weekends hiking in the White Mountains or strolling through the public garden. Ethan proposed one crisp autumn evening. Under a canopy of golden leaves, his voice steady as he offered Caleb a simple silver ring. "I want forever with you," he said. Caleb, tears streaming, said yes. But forever felt fragile when Caleb's phone rang one gray November morning. It was his sister, Anna, her voice tight with urgency. "Mom's sick, Caleb. Alzheimer's. It's moving fast." Caleb's heart lurched. He hadn't spoken to Margaret in years, hadn't seen her since the letter. Anna, the only family member who'd stood by him, had kept him updated on their mother's life. But this news hit like a freight train. "She's asking for you," Anna said. "She doesn't always know who she's asking for, but your name comes up." Caleb hung up, his hands shaking. Ethan, sensing the shift, sat beside him. "What do you want to do?" he asked gently. Caleb didn't know. The idea of facing Margaret again, her judgment, her rejection, felt like walking into a storm. But the thought of her fading, her mind unraveling, stirred something deeper, a longing to reconcile, or at least understand. He booked a flight to Maine the next day. Ethan offered to come, but Caleb needed to face this alone. As the plane descended over Portland's rugged coastline, Caleb's stomach churned. What would he say to a woman who'd disowned him? What could she say if her memories were slipping away? The small hospital in Augusta smelled of antiseptic and regret. Margaret's room was dim, her frail figure barely filling the bed. Her once sharp blue eyes were clouded, her silver hair thin and tangled. Anna stood by the window, her face etched with exhaustion. "She's lucid sometimes," Anna whispered, "but it's unpredictable." Caleb approached the bed, his throat tight. "Mom," he said softly. Margaret's eyes flickered, searching his face. For a moment, recognition sparked. "Caleb," she murmured, her voice fragile. Then, just as quickly, her gaze drifted, lost in a fog Caleb couldn't penetrate. He sat by her side, the silence heavy. He wanted to scream, to demand why she'd pushed him away, but the woman before him wasn't the one who'd written that letter. She was a stranger, her edges softened by illness, her judgment eroded by time. Caleb reached for her hand, expecting her to pull away. She didn't. Her fingers, thin and cold, curled weakly around his. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice breaking. Margaret's eyes met his, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt a flicker of the love they'd once shared. But it was fleeting, and as her gaze drifted again, he wondered if it was too late to heal what had been broken. Caleb spent the next week in Maine, splitting his time between the hospital and Anna's small house nearby. Each visit to Margaret was a gamble. Some days, she recognized him, her eyes lighting up with a warmth that tore at his heart. Others, she stared through him, calling him by names he didn't know. Alzheimer's was a thief, stealing her clarity in unpredictable waves. Yet Caleb kept returning, driven by a need he couldn't name. Anna filled in the gaps of their mother's decline. Margaret had been diagnosed a year ago, but the disease had progressed rapidly. She'd moved into a care facility before the hospital, her life shrinking to a room filled with photos and trinkets from a past she could no longer fully grasp. "She talks about you," Anna said one evening over coffee. "Even when she's confused, your name comes up. I think she regrets it, Caleb." Deep down, Caleb wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at him. Regret didn't erase the letter, the years of silence, the pain of being cast out. Still, he couldn't shake the image of his mother's frail hand in his, the way her fingers had tightened, as if reaching for something lost. Back in Boston, Ethan was a steady presence, calling every night to listen as Caleb poured out his confusion. "You're doing this for you as much as for her," Ethan said one evening, his voice soft through the phone. "You're stronger than you know." Caleb clung to those words, but strength felt like a distant thing when he sat by Margaret's bed, watching her drift between worlds. One afternoon, Margaret was lucid, her eyes sharp as she looked at Caleb. "You're my boy," she said, her voice trembling with conviction. "My Caleb." He froze, unsure if she meant it or if the disease was playing tricks. Then she reached for him, her hand trembling, and whispered, "I was wrong." The words hit like a tidal wave. Caleb's chest tightened, tears burning his eyes. He wanted to ask what she meant, to demand clarity, but her gaze softened, and she began humming a hymn, her mind slipping again. He sat there, stunned, grappling with the possibility that she'd meant it, that somewhere, beneath the dogma and the fear, she'd regretted her rejection. That night, Caleb called Ethan, his voice raw. "She said she was wrong," he told him. "But I don't know if it's real. What if it's just the Alzheimer's talking?" Ethan listened, then said, "It's real if it matters to you. Let it be enough for now." Caleb tried to hold on to that, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. He began bringing small tokens to the hospital, a photo of him and Ethan at the public garden, a sketch he'd drawn of Walt, their dog. Margaret would hold them, her fingers tracing the edges, sometimes smiling, sometimes frowning as if trying to piece together a puzzle. One day, she pointed to Ethan's face in the photo and said, "He's kind. You're happy." Caleb nodded, his throat too tight to speak. As the weeks passed, Caleb's visits became a routine, each one a mix of hope and heartbreak. He learned to cherish the lucid moments, however fleeting, and to sit patiently through the fog. Anna joined him when she could, her presence a quiet comfort. She told him stories of their mother's life after he'd left, how Margaret had struggled with her faith, questioning the church's teachings but never fully breaking free. "She loved you," Anna said. "She just didn't know how to show it." Caleb wasn't sure he could forgive her, not fully. The pain of her rejection was a scar, deep and permanent. But he began to see her not as the woman who disowned him, but as someone trapped by her own fears, her own rigid world. He wondered if love could exist alongside that pain, if he could hold both without letting one destroy the other. One evening, as snow fell outside the hospital window, Margaret reached for Caleb's hand again. "Stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He did, sitting there until she fell asleep, her hand still in his. For the first time, he felt a flicker of peace. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close. Back in Boston, Ethan was planning their wedding, a small ceremony in the spring. Caleb returned home for a weekend, and they spent it wrapped in each other, talking about vows and guest lists. But Caleb's mind kept drifting to Maine, to the woman who'd shaped him, broken him, and was now slipping away. He knew he'd return, not just for her, but for himself, to find closure, or maybe something more. Spring arrived, painting Boston in shades of green and gold, but Caleb's heart was still tethered to Maine. His visits to Margaret became a pilgrimage, each trip a step toward understanding the woman who'd both loved and rejected him. Her lucid moments were rarer now, her mind a patchwork of memories that surfaced and vanished like ghosts. Yet Caleb kept going, driven by a need to bridge the chasm between them before it was too late. One morning, as he sat by her bed, Margaret's eyes locked onto his with startling clarity. "You were always so bright," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I was afraid you'd outshine me." Caleb blinked, caught off guard. It was the closest she'd come to explaining herself, and the words carried a weight he wasn't ready to unpack. He squeezed her hand, unsure how to respond, and she smiled, a small, fragile thing that broke his heart. Back home, Ethan was a whirlwind of wedding plans, his optimism a counterpoint to Caleb's quiet turmoil. They'd chosen a venue, a small garden in the South End, with roses and fairy lights, and Ethan's excitement was infectious. "We're building something real," he told Caleb one night, as they lay tangled in bed. "Something ours." Caleb nodded, but his thoughts drifted to his mother, to the family he'd lost and the one he was creating. Anna called with updates, her voice heavy with the strain of caregiving. She'd found old letters in Margaret's house, unsent drafts addressed to Caleb, filled with apologies she'd never mailed. She wanted to reach out, Anna said, but she didn't know how. Caleb asked her to read one, and the words, halting, earnest, full of regret, cut deeper than the letter that had disowned him. He cried that night, Ethan holding him as the weight of his mother's unspoken love settled over him. The next visit to Maine was different. Caleb brought Ethan this time, needing his strength. They walked into Margaret's room together, and Caleb introduced him, his voice steady despite the nerves. "Mom, this is Ethan, my fiancé." Margaret's eyes flickered, a spark of recognition cutting through the fog. She reached for Ethan's hand, her grip weak but deliberate. "You take care of him," she said, her voice firm. Ethan smiled, tears in his eyes. "Always." That moment became a turning point. Caleb began to see his mother not as a symbol of rejection, but as a woman who'd been shaped by her own battles, faith, fear, and a love she hadn't known how to express. He started bringing more photos, telling her stories of his life with Ethan, of Walt's antics, of the wedding they were planning. Sometimes she listened, sometimes she didn't, but Caleb found solace in the act of sharing. One evening, Margaret was lucid enough to ask about the wedding. "Will it be beautiful?" she murmured, her eyes distant but warm. Caleb nodded, describing the garden, the music, the vows he and Ethan were writing. She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I wish I could see it," she said. Caleb's heart ached, knowing she wouldn't be there, but he promised to bring her photos, to share that day with her in whatever way he could. As the wedding approached, Caleb's visits grew more frequent. He wanted to hold onto every moment of clarity, every fleeting connection. He began to forgive, not because Margaret deserved it, but because he needed to let go of the anger that had anchored him to pain. Ethan supported him through it, his love a constant reminder that Caleb was worthy, that he was enough. The night before they left for Boston to finalize wedding plans, Caleb sat by Margaret's bed, reading to her from a book of poetry she'd once loved. Her breathing was slow, her hand resting in his. As he read, he felt a shift, not closure, but something softer, like the first light of dawn after a long night. He didn't know if she heard him, but he hoped she felt the love in his voice, the same love she'd once given him, now returned. The wedding was a quiet triumph, a celebration of love carved from years of struggle. The South End garden glowed under a late May sun, roses blooming in bursts of red and white. Caleb stood across from Ethan, their hands joined, their vows a promise to weather any storm. Friends and chosen family filled the small crowd, their cheers a balm to Caleb's heart. But as he looked into Ethan's eyes, a part of him ached for Margaret, for the mother who'd never see this day. He brought a photo of her to the ceremony, tucked into his pocket, a snapshot from his childhood, her smile bright as she held him on her lap. It was his way of carrying her with him, of honoring the love they'd once shared, even if it was flawed. When Ethan slipped the ring onto his finger, Caleb felt a weight lift, a sense of freedom he hadn't known he needed. After the wedding, Caleb and Ethan returned to Maine, bringing photos and stories to share with Margaret. Her condition had worsened, her lucid moments now rare, but Caleb was determined to keep his promise. They sat by her bed, showing her images of the garden, the cake, their first dance. Margaret's eyes lingered on a photo of them laughing, Ethan's arm around Caleb's waist. "Happy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Caleb nodded, tears falling. "We are." The visits continued through the summer, each one a delicate dance between hope and loss. Caleb began to see his mother's illness not as a punishment, but as a chance to rewrite their story. He forgave her, not because she'd earned it, but because he wanted to be free. He wanted to love without the shadow of her rejection, to build a life with Ethan unburdened by the past. Anna noticed a change in him. "You're different," she said one evening, as they sorted through Margaret's belongings at the care facility. "Lighter, somehow." Caleb smiled, thinking of Ethan, of the vows they'd made, of the home they were building. "I'm learning to let go," he said. Not of her, but of the pain. One afternoon, Margaret had a rare moment of clarity. She looked at Caleb, her eyes sharp, and said, "I'm proud of you." The words were a gift, unexpected and fragile. Caleb held her hand, his heart full, and told her about his life, his work, his love, his dreams. She listened, her gaze steady, and for a moment they were mother and son again, unbound by the past. But Alzheimer's was relentless. By fall, Margaret's lucid moments were gone, her world reduced to fragments. Caleb kept visiting, reading to her, holding her hand, telling her about his days. He didn't know if she understood, but he believed she felt his presence, his love. Ethan joined him when he could, his quiet strength a reminder that Caleb wasn't alone in this. One evening, as they sat by Margaret's bed, Ethan reached for Caleb's hand. "You've given her more than she ever gave you," he said. Caleb shook his head, tears in his eyes. "No, she gave me life. I'm just giving her love." As winter approached, Caleb began to prepare for the inevitable. Margaret's health was fading, her body as fragile as her mind. He and Ethan planned a quiet holiday in Maine, wanted to be near her, to share whatever time remained. They brought Walt, who curled up at the foot of her bed, his presence a small comfort. Caleb read to her, sang to her, told her stories of the life he'd built. He didn't know if she heard, but he hoped she felt the weight of his love, the way he felt hers, even now. Winter settled over Maine, blanketing Augusta in snow and silence. Margaret's room was a cocoon of warmth, filled with the soft hum of machines and the weight of unspoken words. Caleb and Ethan spent Christmas Eve by her side, the hospital decorated with tinsel and lights that felt both festive and hollow. Caleb held his mother's hand, her breathing shallow, her face peaceful despite the storm that had stolen her mind. He'd brought a small gift, a framed photo of the three of them, taken during one of her lucid moments. In it, Margaret was smiling, her hand resting on Ethan's arm, Caleb's face bright with hope. He sat on her bedside table, a reminder of the connection they'd rebuilt, fragile but real. Anna joined them, her eyes red from sleepless nights. She'd been the bridge between Caleb and their mother, her love unwavering even when Margaret's wasn't. "You gave her peace," Anna said, her voice thick. "You came back." Caleb nodded, unable to speak. He hadn't come back for Margaret alone. He'd come for himself, to heal the boy who'd been rejected, to prove he could love despite the pain. On New Year's Day, Margaret's breathing grew fainter. Caleb sat by her side, Ethan's hand on his shoulder, Walt asleep at their feet. He read to her from Whitman, his voice steady despite the tears. "I celebrate myself and sing myself," he read, the word a prayer for her, for him, for the life they'd shared and lost. As the sun set, casting a golden glow through the window, Margaret stirred. Her eyes opened, clouded but searching, and found Caleb's. She didn't speak, but her hand tightened around his, a silent tether. Tears streamed down her face, and Caleb wept too, feeling the weight of years dissolve in that moment. She didn't need to say she was sorry. Her touch said it all. Margaret passed that night, her hand still in Caleb's, her breathing soft until it stopped. The room was quiet, the world outside still. Caleb sat there, Ethan's arms around him, and felt a strange peace settle over him. He'd lost his mother twice, once to her rejection, once to her illness, but he'd found her again in those final months, in a love they'd pieced together from the wreckage. The funeral was small, held in the church Margaret had once clung to. Caleb spoke, his voice steady as he shared stories of her laughter, her strength, her flaws. He didn't shy away from the pain of her rejection, but he ended with the memory of her hand in his, her tears a silent apology. "She loved me," he said. "It took time, but I felt it." Back in Boston, Caleb and Ethan returned to their life, their home filled with Walt's energy and the warmth of their love. Caleb kept the photo of his mother on their mantle, a reminder of the journey they'd taken. He began designing again, his work softer now, infused with the colors of forgiveness and hope. One evening, as they walked through the public garden, Ethan stopped under the same tree where he'd proposed. "You're my home," he said, pulling Caleb close. Caleb smiled, his heart full. He'd lost so much, but he'd gained more, a love that endured, a life built on truth, a peace hard won. Years later, Caleb would tell their story to friends, to strangers, to anyone who needed to hear it. It was a story of pain, of rejection, of a mother's love lost and found. But above all, it was a story of resilience, of two men who chose love over fear, and of a hand held in the dark, weeping for all that had been and all that could still be.